A university storage room. Metal shelving stretching back into the dark. And on one shelf, a box that has not been opened in 60 years. Inside it, broken pieces of clay, each one smaller than a phone, each one covered in marks that look like bird tracks pressed into mud. For decades, nobody had time to read them. There simply weren't enough people on Earth who could. Then, starting around 2023 and accelerating fast, something changed. Researchers began feeding these fragments into machine learning systems trained to read one of the hardest scripts ever invented by human beings. And piece by piece, sentence by sentence, the system started doing something that used to take a scholar an entire career. They started reading. Not perfectly, not magically, but fast enough and broadly enough that things buried in plain sight for a century finally got noticed. This is the real story of what happened when artificial intelligence was pointed at the oldest writing on Earth, and what it actually found waiting there. To understand why this matters, you have to understand how strange and how old this writing really is. About 5,000 years ago, in the flat river land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in what's now southern Iraq, a civilization we call Sumer built some of the first true cities on the planet. Uruk, Ur, Nippur, Eridu. Places with walls, temples, granaries, and bureaucracies. And bureaucracies need records. So the Sumerians did something that had never quite been done before in the same way. They took a cut reed, pressed its edge into a slab of wet clay, and made small wedge-shaped impressions. Line after line, sign after sign. We call this cuneiform from the Latin for wedge. It's not an alphabet. Each sign can represent a whole word, or a syllable, or several different sounds depending on context. And later scribes writing in the related language of Akkadian used the same signs to mean different things again. It is, by any honest measure, one of the most difficult writing systems ever devised, and it was the dominant script across the Middle East for roughly 3,000 years. Here's the detail that makes this whole story possible. Clay, once it's fired or even just dried and buried, is remarkably durable. Fire didn't destroy these records. It often baked them harder. Cities burned, empires collapsed, and the tablets simply sank into the rubble and waited. When archaeologists began serious excavation in Mesopotamia in the 19th and early 20th centuries, they didn't find hundreds of tablets. They found hundreds of thousands. Museums in London, Paris, Berlin, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Baghdad ended up holding staggering numbers of them. And that's before you count the tablets still sitting in the ground. Estimates for the total number recovered so far run past 500,000, and some scholars think the real number, including everything never excavated, could be several times that. And here is the problem that sat unresolved for more than 100 years. Reading cuneiform fluently takes a specialist roughly a decade of dedicated training just to reach a working level, and mastery takes far longer. The field of Assyriology, the study of these Mesopotamian languages, has never had more than a few thousand practitioners worldwide at any one time. Do the arithmetic. A few thousand scholars working over their careers against a collection of tablets in the hundreds of thousands. The result is exactly what you'd expect. The most famous texts, the epics, the law codes, the royal inscriptions, have been translated and studied intensely, some of them for over a century. But a huge portion of the collection, receipts, letters, administrative lists, fragments of literary texts, has never been read by modern eyes at all. It sits in drawers, photographed at best, cataloged at best, waiting for someone with the right training and the right decade of free time. On top of that, add physical damage. Tablets break, corners snap off, surfaces flake, whole sections crumble to dust. A single object might survive as a dozen separate fragments, and those fragments frequently end up scattered across different museums on different continents, because that's simply how 19th and early 20th century excavation and antiquities trading worked. A tablet dug up in Iraq might have one piece in the British Museum, another in Istanbul, and a third in a university collection in the United States, with nobody ever noticing they belong together, because no single researcher had reason or opportunity to compare them side by side. This is the actual bottleneck that artificial intelligence has started to address, and it's worth being precise about what that means, because the reality is both less sensational and more genuinely impressive than some of the more dramatic claims floating around online. Since the early 2020s, teams of computer scientists and Assyriologists working together at institutions including the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute, Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, and several Israeli and European universities have been building machine learning models trained specifically on cuneiform. Some of these systems work on the physical signs themselves, using computer vision trained on tens of thousands of photographs, and 3D scans to recognize wedge patterns even on worn, broken, or poorly lit tablets, something that's often harder than it sounds, since lighting angle dramatically affects how visible a wedge impression is. Other systems work on the language layer, trained on the large body of already translated Akkadian and Sumerian text to predict missing words, suggest readings for damaged sections, and translate previously unread material into English or other modern languages at a speed no individual could match. One widely reported project used a language model to translate thousands of Akkadian administrative and literary texts, producing draft English translations in a fraction of the time traditional scholarship would take, giving researchers a rough map of a text's content that they could then verify and refine by hand. Other efforts have focused specifically on the jigsaw puzzle problem, using pattern recognition to compare the shape, where pattern, and sign sequences of fragments across different museum collections, flagging pairs or clusters that likely belong to the same original tablet, something that would take a human researcher years of specialized cross-referencing to find, if they ever found it at all. This is not a machine independently discovering some secret language of the gods. It's pattern matching at a scale no person can perform, applied to a genuinely enormous backlog of unread and disconnected material. That distinction matters because it's the difference between a real and useful scientific tool and a myth about a machine that can suddenly commune with the ancient dead. So what is actually turned up using this faster, wider method of reading? Mostly, and this is worth saying honestly, more of what scholars already expected: administrative records, tax lists, legal disputes over inheritance and property, personal letters between merchants complaining about late shipments of grain, which is somehow one of the most human things you can read from 5,000 years ago. But among that ocean of paperwork, cuneiform tablets also preserve some of the oldest surviving literature on the planet, and it's here that things get genuinely fascinating, without needing a single exaggeration. The Sumerians and their Babylonian successors wrote extensively about the creation of humanity, and these texts are not obscure or newly discovered. They've been known to scholarship for well over a century. The most detailed account comes from a text called the Atrahasis, an Akkadian poem that survives on multiple tablets, some more complete than others, first properly assembled and translated by modern scholars in the 20th century. In it, the lower-ranking gods, the Igigi, grow exhausted from performing hard labor, digging canals and rivers for the senior gods. They rebel, and in response, the god Enki, along with the mother goddess, sometimes called Nintu or Mami, creates human beings specifically to take over that labor, mixing clay with the blood of a slain god so that humanity would carry within it both the substance of the earth and something of divine origin. Humans, in this account, are explicitly made to work, to relieve the gods of their burden. This is genuinely striking material, and it's easy to see why it captures people's imagination, especially because related ideas echo forward into other traditions, including the shaping of humanity from clay found in later Mesopotamian-influenced texts, and more distantly, in the opening chapters of Genesis. But it's important to be clear about what this is. It is mythology, a creation narrative reflecting how an ancient agricultural society understood labor, hierarchy, and its own relationship to forces beyond its control. Scholars have studied and debated the Atrahasis and related texts like the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, for generations, and the standard, well-supported reading treats these as religious and literary compositions, not as literal historical records of an actual biological event. Ancient societies across the world produced creation myths that explain human origin through divine crafting, sacrifice, or labor, and Mesopotamia's version, while unusually detailed and unusually old in written form, sits within that broader pattern rather than outside it. Where AI has genuinely added something new isn't in inventing a secret meaning behind these myths, It's in helping reconstruct more complete versions of them. The Atrahasis and the flood story woven into it, which almost certainly influenced the flood narrative in the later Gilgamesh epic, and further downstream, biblical flood accounts, survive across multiple tablets with significant gaps. Machine-assisted tools have helped researchers identify fragments that plausibly fill some of those gaps, propose readings for previously illegible lines based on parallel phrasing found elsewhere in the corpus, and in a handful of documented cases, connect fragments held in separate collections that had never been physically compared before. That is a real and meaningful contribution to the field. It gives scholars fuller text to argue over, not a new hidden doctrine to uncover. It's also worth talking honestly about the limits of these systems, because that's part of doing this story responsibly. Machine translation of cuneiform is still far from perfect. Sumerian is a language isolate, meaning it has no known living relatives. And even human experts disagree on the meaning of specific signs and phrases, depending on context, period, and dialect. Akkadian changed over the roughly 2,000 years it was in active use. So a phrase in an old Babylonian letter from around 1800 BCE doesn't necessarily mean the same thing it would in a Neo-Assyrian text written more than 1,000 years later. AI models trained on this material inherit all of that ambiguity, and in some cases amplify it, producing confident-sounding translations for passages that are genuinely uncertain. Every serious project in this space treats machine output as a first draft, something a trained Assyriologist then checks, corrects, and often substantially revises. Researchers working in this field have been consistently careful to describe these tools as an aid to human expertise, not a replacement for it. And that framing matters, because overstating what the technology can do risks turning a genuinely useful research method into something that sounds more like divination than scholarship. There's a broader, more grounded story here too, about why this kind of work matters beyond a single myth or a single tablet. Cuneiform is, quite simply, humanity's earliest sustained written record of itself. It captures the first law codes, the first receipts, the first poetry, the first recorded complaint about a badly made product, which is a real tablet, a customer complaint about defective copper delivered around 1750 BCE, still preserved in the British Museum. Every fragment brought back into readable form adds a little more texture to how the first literate societies actually thought, argued, worshipped, traded, and organized themselves. The backlog is still enormous. Even with these new tools accelerating the process, researchers estimate that a large share of excavated tablets remain untranslated, simply because there has never been enough trained labor, human or otherwise, to get through all of it. What AI offers here isn't a shortcut to secret knowledge. It's a way to finally start closing a 100-year-old gap between how much ancient writing exists and how much it anyone has actually had the chance to read. So where does that leave the more dramatic claims you might have come across online? The idea that AI has uncovered evidence of a controlled human workforce engineered by beings from the sky, or a hidden record of humanity's true origin deliberately withheld by ancient authorities. Those claims lean on real texts, the Atrahasis, the Enuma Elish, and similar material, but they stretch the evidence well past what it actually supports, reading a 5,000-year-old religious narrative as if it were a covered-up technical report. Mainstream Assyriology, built on more than a century of careful cross-check translation and now assisted by these new computational tools, treats these texts as exactly what their own ancient authors almost certainly intended them to be. Profound, imaginative attempts to explain why human life looks the way it does, written by people trying to make sense of labor, mortality, and their place in a world they didn't fully control. That doesn't make the material any less remarkable. If anything, understanding these texts as the genuine, deliberate literary and religious achievement of a Bronze Age civilization is more impressive than any embellished version could be, because it means human beings, 5,000 years ago, with no machines and no shortcuts, were already grappling with the same questions about origin, purpose, and mortality that we're still grappling with today. What AI has actually given researchers is time. Time that used to be spent squinting at a single worn tablet for weeks can now be spent comparing that tablet against 100 others in minutes, checking whether a damaged phrase has a cleaner parallel somewhere else in the vast, scattered archive. It's given specialists more complete text to work from, more candidate fragment matches to investigate, and a faster first pass through a backlog that would otherwise have taken many more human lifetimes to get through. That's not a small thing. It's the difference between a field that's been quietly under-resourced for a century, finally starting to catch up with the sheer scale of what survives from the ancient world. The tablets aren't hiding a secret. They're just extraordinarily numerous, extraordinarily old, and extraordinarily hard to read. And for the first time, technology is helping close that gap rather than leaving it to a handful of specialists working alone against an impossible pile of clay. Somewhere in a museum basement right now, there's still a box that hasn't been opened. A fragment sitting a few feet from the other half of its own sentence, separated by a filing decision made decades ago by someone who had no way of knowing they belonged together. That's the real frontier here, not a hidden truth about who we are, but simply more of the truth we already have, waiting to be reassembled, one wedge-shaped mark at a time.